He was a filmmaker, he was a sculptor, he was a painter. He used anything and everything to make art. He was an inveterate doodler. His doodles really were the first, if you like, manifestations of the old brain at work.
Very greatest achievement to me and everyone who knew him was he himself and his attitude toward things.
Len remembered a lot of happy moments from New Zealand. They were moments when he felt he was living fully, physically, in the middle of nature, and some of his happiest were at the lighthouse. He thought of the lighthouse in later years as a kind of giant piece of kinetic sculpture.
Black sun. From the age of 7, I lived some more years at a lighthouse, and what a deal for a kid that was. The Great Flasher was a big white lighthouse about 500 yards or more from our house, where my brother and I slept under a roof of very good tin for rain. The wind always whistled in the wires of the telegraph poles to the lighthouse. The roof gathered rainwater. The sea and wind sounds were always good at night. One day I was netting gangs of little fish for frying, and the day was crisp, and the water and the seaweed and the sky so clean that I must have felt the prickly call of the sun, because I stopped fishing and downed both net and catch in the pool where I stood and gazed straight at the sun. And I went home empty-handed with a ball of fire in my head.
Here is a painting that might have a couple of interesting points for you. It's called Fern People, and I did it in New York in about 1944 when I first arrived here. So the interesting thing is that when I look at it, I realize that in my design, I copied the Polynesian scroll effect, the kind of frond of the fern, you know? And particularly up here, you see? Anyhow, it's a little indication of being called Fern People, how I relate most of my imagery to nature anyhow. But in this instance, I think it's definitely a New Zealand type of feeling about it. This is a model, see, how to get an idea. Don't go to Olympia or Delphi or anything like that. Get up before sunrise, go up on a marvelous view of your surroundings, your environment. Get up there and wait for the sun to come up, and do it only to get an idea. One morning, I was looking at the clouds. I thought, well, that's right, Constable used to do clouds. He used to paint clouds to try and capture their movement, simulate movement. And I thought, that's nice, yeah, but why did he do that? Why didn't they're moving so wonderfully, why the hell not do something that moved, actually moved to simulate movement, you know? And bang! Christ, I felt as if, the sky had opened up and God had reached down and said, Len, you got an idea, baby, go do it, see? So, all right. I went to it, and from there on in, I was cracky about motion.
He learned everything in New Zealand from libraries. He even read Freud, can you imagine it? It was very new then, and a young man or teenager trying to get through that stuff. But also all the books on primitive art. He just ate them up.
It was in Christchurch that I realized that Polynesian art had a lot of fascinating, original kind of unique form to it and design. And I was very much taken with that. And you're looking at a sketch I did of a Polynesian carving in Wellington, in one of the Wellington museums there. And from there I just concentrated on old brain art, that is primitive brain art. Because temperamentally, I think I was trying to dig deep and find my own original imagery. And these primitive works of art gave me a lead to what I was after.
The primitive art goes with the primitive people and their way of life, and that's why he set out to spend his life in the South Seas and went to Samoa for the 2 years.
So my great trip was to get on one of these Cook tour boats, great big boat, you know, a steamboat, I don't know what the hell they were there in those days. As a tourist, you know, you pay your 21 pounds or whatever it was. So I went around to all the island because I wanted an island where I could stay all my life. I wanted paradise. If Gauguin could do it, why the hell couldn't I? See? Anyway, I ended up in Samoa with a job. As soon as I'd saved up enough, I went right in and lived with my best friend, Sa'olevao. That means born in the bush. And I lived there fantastically happily, too happily. The miracle of being in that absolute place is you don't want to work. Now, I had to be in my bonnet about wanting to just get something out that would last longer.
So having found your paradise...
Oh, no, I can make this interesting. Excuse me.
I always remember Len for the song which he brought back from Samoa with him. It went, Papalangi maki vai ofu mai sai sai. Papalangi oi oi ia se lili oi.
When I got absolutely perfectly set up, General Richardson, the administrator of the island, called me on the mat and said, we are getting rid of everybody who's living with Samoans. All Europeans from here on in are not allowed to live with Samoans. So I went back to Richardson and I made a deal. You pay my way to Sydney and I'll leave Samoa. And he jumped at it. I was rather insulted.
When I first met Len, he was sitting on a curb outside a pub, sketching, and I, as a matter of interest, looked over his shoulder to see what he was doing. And he appeared to be drawing geometrical designs, nothing related to the human figure or to pastoral scenes or anything like that. And he turned over the sheets of his pad, and I saw he was drawing other kinds of designs which looked very much like forms you'd see under a microscope.
I went to Sydney, and this is a sketch I did in Sydney. But I didn't go to Sydney to sketch nudes. I went to Sydney to sketch Australian Aboriginal art. So with this sketch, we have the last time I tried to do good Western-style draftsmanship. You're now looking at a sketch which I call doodles. Now, doodles come right from the depth of your unconscious. If you practice it sufficiently, you get the hang of allowing the pencil and the images to take shape, not caring what they represent, so long as they look good and fascinating to you.
It was a great revelation when Len began looking at movies. The movie that made the biggest impression on him was something called Pearls and Savages, which was an anthropological film shot in Papua New Guinea by Frank Hurley. Suddenly, Len saw that all his interests could come together. His interests in old brain, tribal art, his interests in movement could be worked through the medium of film.
1926, a day on the beach. We were jogging along on the sloping mirror of cool, wet sand just below high water mark. Suddenly, Len stopped, stared long at the sun. Then he turned, waved his hand, ran, dived under the dumpers, out onto the sandbank, out into the deep black water, and out of sight. I kept on jogging till the beach grew cold and empty. Next day, he was gone. He left no address.
Len made his way to London by meeting a drunken stoker in a Sydney pub and buying his ship's papers for £5. And so Len was able to go on board the ship under an assumed name, and he stoked his way to London.
I was a crew member, see, I was a stoker on the 22,000-ton Euripides, and that would fill a book. What the hell I did on that ship and what we went through, but we won't. What's the next question?
The artists that Len encountered in London were really charmed by this strange character from the colonies, this cowboy from the colonies, the stoker sculptor, as some of them called him.
Len at the time was living on a house barge which was owned by Kennington and A.P. Herbert jointly, and a lot of artists used to come down to see Kennington at work, and Frank Dobson took him along to meet the people in the 7 and 5. And the 7 and 5 at that particular time were the most advanced group of artists in London. When they saw some of Len's work, they immediately took him under their wing and made him a member, and were instrumental in exhibiting his stuff along with their annual exhibitions. During his spare time, Len managed to get a job in a commercial art studio, doing commercial films for beer and toothpaste and things like that. And he got a job as a filler-in for 3 commercial artists. And while he was there, he studied the rostrum camera and the methods of animation very thoroughly.
When he made a film, Len was determined to make an old brain film. Now, what was an old brain film going to be like? And so he imagined that he was an Australian Aboriginal making a film. He imagined he was a tribal artist making a kind of creation myth. He didn't want to imitate Aboriginal art or Maori art. He wanted to make his own kind of tribal art.
Tusalava, T-U-S-A-L-A-V-A. Now that means everything comes around full circle and you start over again. You know, replication, in other words. It was a cut and dried symbolic business of self-replication in this film. Mm-hmm. But it used organic kind of symbols, male-female type things with big anxiety, octopus, spider type jobs, beating up this poor old cocoon, which was me, no doubt, in this goddamn film, see? So it lasted 10 minutes. Well, I spent 2 years making that thing, and that film, see, in black and white. And it was only shown once for 10 minutes. See, that was the only public showing for 10 minutes until in the 50s it was shown, in the 60s it was shown again. So that was 1929, I think, or 28, and I paid for it all myself, except the London Film Society paid for the photography and the film stock. I paid for all the bloody food and herring heads and things I used to have to eat while I made the thing. It cost money, you know, to buy all that paper and ink and stuff.
When Len finished Tu Salava, he was very eager to make several more movies in this tribal art style. Unfortunately, no money. The London Film Society money had run out, and so he went through some very difficult years not being able to afford to make another film with a camera. What he could do is get offcuts of film from friends and play around with them.
Well, the experience which he had of working on Tu Salava and cartoon animation was far too laborious. And he thought of other ways of doing abstract forms straight onto film, painting them direct onto film, instead of photographing them as you do in animation.
Well, I know about animation, to hell on it. I'll animate direct on film. And it's all you do is slob a lot of color, you know. I used to love color so much I used to drool. Actually have to almost wear a bib. You know, this translucent color on film, you hold it up, there's no color like it. So finally I went up to John Grierson, who was the producer of the government film unit, and say, John, look, see this wiggle waggle stuff and all this music? All you need to do is put a slogan in and you've got yourself a spot or something. You've got a commercial for your General Post Office film unit. So he said, all right, how much would it cost? So I thought, a pot of paint, this, that, and the other, and a few brushes on, a celluloid. So I gave him a very low figure. So anyway, they got the cheapest goddamn film on record in animation ever, see?
It's said in New Zealand that give me a piece of number 8 fence wire and I can do anything. Len's art has a lot of the Kiwi do-it-yourself streak in it. For example, so you can't make a film with a camera. No problem, no trouble. We'll make it without a camera.
He did a lot of experiments at that time with stencils and getting the stencils to register in the film. And then a lot of experiments with different dyes that would not flake off the celluloid, that would not bleed around the edges of the stencils, that he could have a degree of control with.
Len had this extraordinary cottage industry going in his little home. He would paint hundreds of little bits of film, usually 24 frames at a time, and hang them up to dry. And so the entire house was full of these bits of confetti hanging from every available inch of clothesline or right through the living room.
My film stuff is old brain stuff. It's nothing to do with the new brain and literature. It's to do with the body and kicking around.
Savings bank puts a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for you.
In films like Rainbow Dance and Trade Tattoo, he took the new 3-colour to 3-colour separation processes, which were just coming on the market, and he came up with a totally eccentric and fascinating way of using them. He decided that if you could break colour into 3 separate strips, you might as well have some fun. You could feed black and white footage through that process and colour it anything you liked.
Well, Len refused to repeat himself. Each new film he made on something else. Eventually, he definitely wanted to try handling human beings.
I was furious with you. You were simply beastly.
You're very breezy tonight. Tonight.
Yes, I went to a grand party last night. With Richard Salt.
That old salt liquor. He's poison. He's poison for a girl like you.
You know he's an old friend.
How about saving some of this friendliness for the weekend, if you don't mind?
You're impossible, Jack.
Oh, you're impossible. You're a silly little scrimp, that's all.
Jack, I don't want to talk about it anymore.
All right, then. Goodbye. Goodbye. All right, then. Goodbye.
I'm gonna write words oh so sweet. They're gonna knock me off my feet.
Dear Jack,
A lot of kisses on the bottom.
I was simply furious with you last night. You needn't have lost your temper so over Richard. You were simply beastly. This bit of quarrelling is stupid. Please apologise by return post, or our weekend is ruined, and everything else too. Yours ever, Evelyn.
I'm gonna sit right down and write myself a letter.
During the war, he was shooting war films, largely from airplanes in Scotland, where they came into this, I think a lot of them were hydroplanes, but they came into this bay that had mountains going at the back of it. That's what he did during the war. Then they brought him over here to become a director for March of Time.
It was a kind of a sinecure. I got a lot of money for doing hardly anything like most of these. I was a director, and I'd have an assistant and a crew, a sound crew, and off we'd go on an assignment. And one time it would be lining up and speaking and asking Einstein to do this, that, and the other, because We wanted to document the lead into the atomic business. And the next minute we'd be in a slaughterhouse telling the goddamn guy how to hell to chop the thing so it was photographically okay.
He enjoyed it, but he only did this about 4 or 5 days out of the month, which was wonderful, because then he could get on with his own stuff. It was perfect. That time he was writing a lot. That's the period he did all those, silhouettes on the floor.
He wanted to experiment with other kinds of filmmaking. One of the most interesting experiments is the shadowgram method. He made some photographs in this way.
And he'd ask these people, like George O'Keeffe and these 2 psychiatrists from Yale and me and the plumber across the street, and then he decorated the plumber with all of his plumbing tools around his head, and they'd lay flat and then photograph them.
He also made a film called Colour Cry, quite an extraordinary film, made in the dark using the method that Man Ray had pioneered, known as the rayogram or the shadowgram or the photogram. Len felt that in a big city like New York, in a modern city like New York, there must be lots of people wanting to sponsor interesting work. And so he spent several years going around advertising agencies, trying New York television, and to his surprise, he found them a lot less interested in experiment than his old sponsors such as John Grierson and Cavalcanti back in London. Unfortunately, the Chrysler Motor Company wasn't quite so enthusiastic about African tribal drumming, and the little commercial never got used.
But the idea of Len, with all his naivety, practically a boy from the bush, with no sophistication whatever, going over and jumping into that bloody crocodile pond and expecting to get away with it, I don't know. I just can't understand it.
I first met Len Lye, unhappily, when I was a director of a film to try to show how Pittsburgh was beautiful, or is beautiful, and not in that sense of the great films of the 30s, the beauty of its smoke and so on, but the cleanup of the city, and that was such a desperate circumstance that they turned it over to me, the arty one in the company, and which, by the way, was on film, and they told me to hire whomever would be necessary to take this Union footage of Pittsburgh, which did not look at all beautiful, and who could beautify it. And so I hired Stan Vanderbeek and Len Lye and Ouija to come up to Princeton, New Jersey, and help beautify Pittsburgh. And Len Lye was very, very grouchy about this and about all the. First of all, he knew that all they were after was his name in a way and some stature and some tricks. And he was very clear at the table, the board meeting and so on, where he first appeared, that this was far too expensive, that the techniques that he used through the old Grierson GPO were so expensive that that they couldn't afford it. And then he explained to them in details how expensive they were and how they couldn't afford it. And therefore that was his only contribution to this miserable film.
And where's the vacuum nozzle?
Under the stairs, where it always is.
Oh.
Well, one day I was walking down from our house here on Bethune Street, just this next block, over to the main drag on Hudson Street, and I heard somebody yelling, Ann, I need something, and I just realized you've got one. So he ran after me, and he said, I'm making this little piece of sculpture, and I've got steel rings, but I've got to have a round gold ring in the middle. So I said, okay, here it is. And there it is, ever since.
Len switched from making films to making sculpture basically because he ran out of money for film. He declared that as an experimental filmmaker, he was on strike. He figured that if he just waggled a piece of metal, played with a piece of metal, he would be able to do things more cheaply. As it turned out, in the long run, it was just as expensive. Kinetic sculpture, cinema, kinema, kinesthesia, they all come from that root word meaning movement. And that's what Len was about.
I'm composing figures of motion, and I'm composing them out of very springy spring steel. And I'll show you one of them. You take a piece of steel, and I attach it to a motor. But you don't get into devising anything with it until you're in the mood. Because unless you can keep trying to find something that's simply fascinating to you, there's not much point. So you wait until you're in the mood, and then when you find a piece of steel, you might go like this with it, and roll it about, and so on, and you gradually get the grip of an idea.
He had this whole process of working, which he always described as play, where he would take a material, let's say if I brought back a sample of a sheet of steel, and he would just play with it. He would bend it, and he would bang it, and he would whip it through the air, just to feel it, basically to feel it in his own body.
In my studio, I make these type models, kind of a prototype. And they're really planned for the big scale image. For instance, this is now 9 feet, and this is 6 foot high. Why, it would be 60 foot high and 90 foot long. And I've checked with the steel mill people, and they tell me it's feasible, the thing I want. Now, when it's that size, it would serve as a gateway to a temple.
The temple which he had conceived and which we have models of, and hopefully someday, somewhere, this will be created, perhaps in a desert area, such as we have here in New Zealand, or in Arizona could be created, and with a major kinetic display of works that you enter, you're awed by it, you're thunderstruck by it, and you go away from it saying, well, that was one hell of a good experience.
Here we have a version of temple art in this tiny model, and I'll explain it to you if you're with that kind of thing for a while. For instance, this main one here is a sea god, and he is 150 foot long, and at the end of the routine, which is a kinetic composition of motion, undulating sea serpents and whatnot, this particular sea serpent, which is the sea god, raises up and emits a 25 million volt arc through the cave goddess. This item here, of course, is the cave goddess. If you don't believe it, well, can't be helped. But this sea serpent, anyhow, shoots this fantastic arc of electricity through the mouth of the cave goddess and hits this sunball.
He had a small model of Trilogy, a working model in his studio, and I had a look at this and we ran it, and mechanically it was very crude and electronically it kept breaking down, but we got people in to help and we got this work going, and I said, yes, that's wonderful. How large do you want it? And he said, oh, about 12 feet high, about 4 meters high, and I felt that we could accommodate that. And I felt that we'd got to satisfaction in what Len required, and back I went to New York. This took about a year, and I went back to New York and did the presentation to Len, and he absolutely floored me, because he said, oh, yeah, well, I've been thinking about this, John, and it's great what you've done, but we now need to get it into the true element of scale. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, we have to double the size. We've got to have it at least 20 feet high. And that's really where we need to get to.
this friend. He's a noted biologist, a fellow named Oscar Hector. And I said, Oscar, this painting is called The King of Plants Meets the First Man. And here's the King of Plants, and there's the first man. And I said, I called him the first man because he looked like a gang of fossilized nerves and veins, you know. And Oscar said, no. He said, it may look like a man to you, but to me it looks like a brain circuitry system. There you have a glial cell. Glia, I said, how do you spell it? G-L-I-A. Glia, all right. He said, there you have a synapsis where the electrical force jumps from one circuit to another. Oh, I'll tell you what the significance is to all that. It means that my unconscious, my deep desire to express my innermost feelings was channeled through my unconscious into information which my old, primitive, unconscious side of my brain could connect with. And it connected with my cells and the genetic information in my cells and came up with the visual representation of that information.
Oh, they're too complicated to get into. They were so personal, and he thought everybody'd understand them so easily, and I don't think anybody really did. And I spent years of my life rewriting and typing and trying to make these things comprehensible. So then I give them to him, and he, correct it also. So I finally quit. I said, no more. He changed it all back to incomprehensible.
I don't mean this one. I mean the round one.
Under the stairs, where it always is.
He would hunt all over the city for different tools or the household to try to find different implements that would create an image. And he would just play with different things. Finding thumbtacks that would create a line that he liked, finding hat pins that would create a certain line. He loved to use saws because the saws, the blade, the individual teeth of the saws would fit into the 16 millimeter frames and give him a registration so that if he scraped it across, it would have the same image in each frame. So he was always experimenting with saws especially.
What we're trying to do, let me tell you, we're trying to make two lines go like that on the screen. And you get that effect by drawing two straight lines from one side to the other of the film. And this is very simple. By taking the scriber and indenting it in and making a good scrape right through there like that, crossing over and making it go again by putting in this scriber and zigging it along like that. And what you get in the end is something like this.
Describing images in free radicals where the white bars are like going like this, upwards and downwards and backwards. And he would show me these movements. And he said, this is what I wanted the lines to do. And that was what he would keep trying to achieve, was that kind of jerky, powerful, banging, crashing, percussive movement that he was feeling within his arms and shoulders and hands and all that. So he was always attempting in his art to recreate those feelings that he was having in his body.
The myth at least goes that he kept working on that film in little ways till very near his death. Certainly, the forms of it that I saw, started seeing 3 years ago from now, were immensely important to me. And even more important to me, particles in space. Partly, again, the example that a man dying is actually sitting in bed, like Proust, so to speak, carving, etching on film his own death testament, and which particles in space is to me. And the grounds for it surely are free radicals, which is based on his concept of the old brain going directly, if you can tap the old brain's knowledge that the cells themselves are telling you of their life and therefore yours, and that giving information that there's no way to get through consciousness. In other words, you have to go into a really deep unconsciousness to get this information, and then that it travels all the way along his arm down to this hand holding this engraving needle, etching this a frame at a time on film, is just amazing.
New York, leukemia. Eccentric? Not really, just a square peg. I doubt if Len even knew how to ride a bike, if you know what I mean. The trouble with Len was he was born out of time and stayed young too long.
This is at our house up in Warwick, with the setting sun coming through the window. It's about 3 weeks before Len died, and we were having our usual rum and fresh orange juice before dinner. And then I looked across the room, and I saw his reflection on the white wall from that sun window. I always think it's Len's spirit.